Welcome back to the Photographers Unite Photography Challenge series. My name is Dan Hurd, and in this video we're going to talk about the exposure triangle and how to use the settings in your camera to get the photograph that you want and to get the exposure correct. So with that, let's get started. So with learning how to do photography, you may have heard the term the exposure triangle. So we'll start out the video by talking about the three elements that make up the exposure triangle. Those three elements are shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. So what we'll start with first is the shutter speed. And the shutter speed is basically how long your sensor and your camera is exposed to light. Okay? So the slower the shutter speed, the more light that's let in. And the faster the shutter speed, the less light that's let in. So with a faster shutter speed, you can end up with an underexposed image. With a faster shutter speed, with a slower shutter speed, you can end up with an overexposed. I think I got that right. An overexposed image. Okay? So basically a faster shutter speed will freeze action. Like in this image here, I took a picture of a car going by and I was able to freeze it because I used a very fast shutter speed. So you don't see any motion blur. The tires are nice and sharp that are rotating. The background is nice and sharp. So that's a fast shutter speed. And a slower shutter speed will allow anything that's moving, it'll actually blur it. So if that's what you're looking for, is to blur anything that's moving, you can do that. And actually you can even get into what's called long exposure, which is like this image here. And this was a very long exposure with cars going through an underpass. So what it actually did is it blurred the tail lights and the headlights, so you get what's called light trails. So if that's something you're interested in doing, you can do that. You can experiment with your shutter speed. And so shutter speed, again, is basically how fast the shutter is how long your sensor is exposed to the light. Now aperture is basically, if you look at like this lens I have here, you'll see this is a very wide aperture lens. I don't know if you guys can see this. If not, I'll maybe get a different video. But you can see like right through there, there's a really big hole. So that lets a lot of light in. Okay. So say for instance, you want to use a very fast shutter speed. Well, it's not going to let very much light hit the sensor so fast. So you want to have a wide aperture to let a lot of light in. With the faster shutter speed, you want a wider aperture. Now, conversely, if you have a slower shutter speed, you may want to shut the aperture down so it's a smaller hole, so not so much light gets into the sensor. Actually, it's a little bit backwards on the lens. The smaller the number, the wider the aperture. The larger the number, the smaller the aperture. So one of the effects with the aperture is when you have a wide aperture, you have a very shallow depth of field. So basically, like you can see in this image here that I'm going to show you, you can see that the foreground is not in focus, and then the plant is in focus, and then the background is out of focus. And that was because I shot this with a very wide open aperture, so the plane of focus was very narrow. Now conversely, you can use a narrow aperture or a larger aperture number, and your plane of focus becomes much larger. So as you can see in this image here, you know, the foreground, the fence post is in focus as well as the building in the background. And I was able to achieve that by using a very small aperture, or using the larger number on the lens. So that's aperture, and you kind of want to balance the two. Actually, you want to balance all three, but those are the two primary ones that you want to use to try to get the proper exposure. And if you can't get the proper exposure by using those two, then there's another setting. It's called the ISO. And basically the ISO is how sensitive the sensor is to light. Okay, so with a low ISO, the sensor is not so sensitive. It doesn't, it's like almost, I don't know, probably not a good analogy, but almost like squinting your eyes as opposed to having your eyes wide open, okay? So it's not so sensitive to light. The higher the ISO, the more sensitive it is to light, the brighter your exposure will become. However, the disadvantage to using a higher ISO is that it introduces noise to your image, okay? Now, all cameras have what's called a base ISO. In other words, the camera that I'm shooting with right here has a base ISO of 100, and that generally means that at 100 ISO, the image will be the sharpest that that sensor can produce, okay? The higher the ISO that I go with it though, say if I shot it at like 2500 ISO, this camera that I'm shooting with right here will actually introduce a lot of noise or grain. It'll kind of look like grain into the image, almost to the point where the higher ISO you go to where the image can become unusable, okay? So generally you don't want to move that ISO. You'd like to try to keep it on your base if you can. The only time I move my ISO off of the 100 ISO is if I can't get the exposure correct with just the shutter and the aperture alone to get the look that I want for that image, okay? So those are the three things. Those are the three elements. Most cameras, I don't know of any camera that wouldn't have it. Actually has a little tool in the camera to show you how your exposure is set up. Actually, there's actually two tools. The first one is an exposure meter, and I will show you what exposure meter looks like on my 90D, Canon 90D. And as you can see, when I turn the shutter speed higher or lower, the exposure meter either goes too bright or too dark. And the same with the aperture. If I keep the shutter speed the same, if I move the aperture higher or lower, it affects the exposure. Okay, and also the ISO affects that too. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to balance everything to make sure that you have the settings you want to get the image that you want as close as possible to getting that meter in the middle. The other tool, and it's a little bit outside the scope of this, is called the histogram. And I'm really not going to get into that because that can kind of be a little more advanced usage than what we want to do when we want to talk about today. So use the exposure meter. I would encourage you during these challenges to use the manual setting on your camera, and to set those settings manually. It's good practice, and you'll start to learn how to capture the image that you want to. Experiment. That's the best way to find out how things work with your camera. Shoot lots of pictures and experiment and see what the different settings do in your camera. So with that, I'm going to wrap up this video. Hopefully you were able to learn something. If not, hopefully this was a good review for you. And our next video is going to be our first challenge. And with that, we're going to be the challenge is going to be depth of field. So that's probably going to involve using your aperture. So if you have any questions, feel free to leave them down in the comments. Andy and I will do our best to answer them. And with that, I will see you next time.